Billionaire CEO's paralyzed wife walks again after pizza delivery guy shows her this simple method. The rain hammered against the massive windows of the Smith mansion as George Smith stood in his corner office, staring at his reflection in the glass. At 42, he was the youngest billionaire CEO in the tech industry, yet the man looking back at him appeared decades older. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it countless times that day. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the accident that changed everything. Before we begin, tell us your city in the comments. We love connecting with viewers worldwide. Hit like and subscribe if you're ready for stories that change perspectives. Your support fuels our mission to share extraordinary human experiences. Now, prepare for a story you'll never forget. George's phone buzzed with another urgent message from his company, but he ignored it. Nothing seemed important anymore. Not the billion-dollar deals, not the board meetings, not even the empire he had built from nothing. All that mattered was upstairs in their bedroom, his wife Sarah, who hadn't walked a single step since that terrible night. Mr. Smith. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. The physical therapist is here for Mrs. Smith's session. George closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Another therapist. Another round of false hope. They had tried everything. The best doctors in the world, experimental treatments, cutting-edge technology. His fortune, which once seemed limitless, had been poured into medical bills and treatments that promised miracles but delivered only disappointment. Send him up, George replied, though his heart wasn't in it anymore. Dr. James Wilson was the 15th physical therapist they had hired. Unlike the others who came dressed in expensive suits with briefcases full of credentials, James arrived in simple scrubs with kind eyes and gentle hands. He had worked with paralyzed patients for 20 years and had a reputation for being honest about what was possible. After examining Sarah thoroughly, James sat down with George in the hallway outside their bedroom. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Smith," James said quietly. "The damage to Sarah's spinal cord is extensive. The other doctors were right. Conventional medicine has reached its limits here." George felt his heart sink. Not again. He couldn't handle another dead end. However, James continued, holding up a hand. "I've learned in my years of practice that healing isn't always about what we can see in X-rays or MRI scans. Sometimes, the mind and spirit play a bigger role than we understand." "What are you saying?" George asked, a tiny spark of hope flickering in his chest. "I'm saying that while I work with Sarah on her physical therapy, you need to focus on her emotional and mental healing. She's given up, Mr. Smith. I can see it in her eyes. Until she believes she can walk again, no amount of medical intervention will help." That evening, George sat beside Sarah's bed, watching her stare blankly at the ceiling. She had once been the most vibrant person he knew, a successful architect who lit up every room she entered. Now, she barely spoke, barely ate, barely lived. "The new therapist thinks you've given up," George said softly. Sarah's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment. "Maybe I have." "Don't say that. We'll find a way. We always do." "George, stop." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "We've spent 3 years chasing miracles that don't exist. I'm tired of hoping. I'm tired of trying. I'm tired of being your burden." "You're not a burden. You're my wife. You're my everything." Sarah turned her head toward the wall. "I used to be your everything. Now I'm just a project you can't fix." The words hit George like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, he feared she might be right. Had he been treating her recovery like another business deal to close? Weeks passed in the same routine. James came 3 times a week for physical therapy sessions that showed minimal progress. Sarah went through the motions without enthusiasm. George threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the growing distance between them. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was a Friday night, and George was working late in his office again. Sarah was upstairs, probably asleep or watching television. The house felt emptier than ever, despite being filled with staff. Around 9 o'clock, Sarah's stomach began to rumble. She hadn't eaten much at dinner, picking at the gourmet meal their chef had prepared. On a whim, she decided she wanted pizza. Not the fancy artisan kind their chef could make, but greasy, simple pizza from a local shop. It felt like a small rebellion against the sterile perfection that had become her life. She called Tony's Pizza, a small family-owned shop about 20 minutes away. The woman who answered sounded rushed and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, but our usual delivery driver called in sick, and we're really backed up. It might be an hour or more before we can get to you." "That's okay," Sarah said. "I'm not going anywhere." The irony of her words wasn't lost on her. 90 minutes later, the doorbell finally rang. The housekeeper had already gone home, and George was still locked in his office, so Sarah wheeled herself to the front door in her wheelchair. She struggled with the heavy door, finally managing to pull it open. Standing on her doorstep was not what she expected. Instead of a typical delivery driver, she saw a young man about 25 years old with kind eyes and a genuine smile. His name tag read Mark, and despite clearly having had a long night, he seemed upbeat. "Mrs. Smith? One large pepperoni pizza." "That's me," Sarah said, handing him the money. Mark noticed her wheelchair but didn't stare or look uncomfortable like most people did. Instead, he glanced past her into the enormous foyer of the mansion. "Wow, this place is incredible," he said with genuine admiration. "Did you design it?" Sarah was surprised by the question. Most people assumed George was responsible for everything about their life. "Actually, yes. I'm an architect. Or I was, anyway." "Was? You don't do it anymore." Sarah gestured to her wheelchair. "Hard to visit construction sites when you can't walk." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather was a carpenter. Lost his leg in an accident when I was little. He said the hardest part wasn't learning to use the prosthetic. It was remembering that he was still the same person who could build beautiful things." Something in Mark's tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was wisdom in his words that seemed beyond his years. "He kept working?" Sarah asked. "Until the day he died. He said his hands still worked, his mind still worked, and his heart still worked. That was all he needed." Mark handed her the pizza, but instead of leaving immediately, he paused. "Can I ask you something? And please don't think I'm crazy." Sarah nodded, curious. "Do you ever try to walk when no one's looking?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "What?" "My cousin was paralyzed in a motorcycle accident. The doctors said he'd never walk again. But every night, when his wife was asleep, he would transfer himself to the floor and just try. Not the formal physical therapy stuff, just simple attempts to feel his legs, to imagine them working." "Did it help?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why she was engaging in this conversation with a pizza delivery driver. "Well, his walking today. Not perfectly, and not without pain, but his walking. The doctors called it impossible, but he did it anyway." Mark shifted the pizza bag in his hands. "Look, I'm not a doctor, and I don't know anything about your specific situation. But I've noticed something in my job. I deliver to a lot of people, and the ones who seem happiest aren't necessarily the ones with the most money or the biggest houses. They're the ones who haven't given up on themselves." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. When was the last time someone had talked to her like she was a whole person instead of a broken one? "The thing is," Mark continued, "everyone always focuses on the big dramatic moment. The day you take your first step. But what if it's not about that? What if it's about all the little moments when you choose to try, even when no one's watching?" After Mark left, Sarah sat in her wheelchair in the foyer for a long time, holding the warm pizza box and thinking about his words. She couldn't remember the last time she had tried to move her legs without a therapist watching and taking notes. That night, after George had finally come to bed and fallen asleep, Sarah quietly transferred herself from the bed to the floor. Her arms were strong from years of using the wheelchair, but her legs felt foreign and heavy. She placed her hands on her thighs and closed her eyes, not trying to force anything, just trying to remember what it felt like when her legs were part of her body instead of just weight she carried around. Nothing happened. She hadn't really expected anything to happen. But somehow, The act of trying felt important. The next week, Mark delivered pizza again. This time, Sarah was ready for him. "I tried what you suggested," she said when he handed her the food. "How did it go?" "Nothing happened. But..." She paused, trying to find the words. "It felt good to try something that was just for me. Not for George, not for the doctors, just for me." Mark smiled. "That's the most important part. Can I tell you something else my grandfather used to say?" Sarah nodded. "He said the body follows the mind, but the mind follows the heart. If your heart isn't in it, nothing else matters. What if my heart is too broken to believe anymore? Then maybe you start smaller. Maybe instead of believing you'll walk again, you just believe that you're worth trying for." Over the next several weeks, Mark's deliveries became a regular thing. Not because Sarah was addicted to pizza, but because their conversations had become the highlight of her week. Mark had a way of seeing possibilities where everyone else saw limitations. "You know," Mark said during one visit, "I've been thinking about what you said about not being able to visit construction sites. But couldn't you design buildings that are more accessible? I mean, who better than someone who actually lives with these challenges?" The idea hit Sarah like lightning. She had been so focused on what she couldn't do anymore that she had never considered what she might be uniquely qualified to do now. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah didn't just try to move her legs. She also opened her laptop and began sketching building designs, structures that would be beautiful and functional for people with disabilities. George found her in the morning, asleep at her desk with architectural drawings scattered around her. "Sarah." He gently shook her shoulder. "What's all this?" Sarah woke up and looked around, momentarily disoriented. Then she remembered. "I was designing," she said, wonder in her voice. "For the first time in years, I was actually creating something." George picked up one of the drawings, a community center with ramps that looked like artistic elements rather than afterthoughts, with wide spaces that felt open and inviting rather than clinical. "These are incredible," he breathed. "Sarah, this is some of your best work ever." For the next month, Sarah threw herself into her new project with energy George hadn't seen since before the accident. She was designing a whole series of accessible buildings, homes, offices, schools, that were beautiful and barrier-free. More importantly, she was continuing her nighttime routine of trying to connect with her legs. She didn't tell George or James, the physical therapist. This was her private journey. Then came the night when something was different. Sarah was on the floor as usual, her hands on her legs, when she felt the faintest sensation, like a distant echo of feeling. She gasped and concentrated harder. There it was again, the tiniest hint of sensation in her right leg. Her heart raced. Was she imagining it? She tried to move the leg and felt a microscopic twitch in her thigh muscle. She wanted to scream for George, to call the doctors, to celebrate. But something held her back. Mark's words echoed in her mind. The ones who seem happiest are the ones who haven't given up on themselves. This moment wasn't for anyone else. It was for her. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah felt more sensations returning. Tiny movements that were barely visible, but real nonetheless. She began spending longer periods on the floor, not just trying to move, but visualizing herself walking, remembering what it felt like to feel the ground beneath her feet. Meanwhile, her architectural work was gaining momentum. George had quietly reached out to some contacts, and several organizations were interested in her accessible design concepts. The night everything changed started like any other. Sarah had ordered pizza, and Mark arrived right on schedule. But this time, something was different about him too. "I have something to tell you," Mark said as he handed her the food. "This is going to be my last delivery to you." Sarah's heart sank. "Are you quitting?" "No, but I got accepted to architecture school. I've been saving money from this job to pay for it. Your designs that you showed me last week inspired me to apply." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "Mark, that's wonderful." "It's because of you," Mark said. "Watching you find your passion again reminded me that it's never too late to chase your dreams." After Mark left, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. She was thrilled for him, but she realized how much she had come to depend on their conversations. He had become more than a pizza delivery driver. He was the person who had helped her remember who she was. That night, Sarah's routine felt different. As she lowered herself to the floor, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing before. This wasn't just about trying to walk again. This was about honoring the person she had rediscovered with Mark's help. She placed her hands on her legs and closed her eyes. But instead of just trying to move, she thought about everything she wanted to do with her life. The buildings she wanted to design, the barriers she wanted to eliminate, the person she wanted to be. "Come on," she whispered to her legs. "We have work to do." And then, for the first time in 3 years, she felt her right leg move with intention. Not just a twitch, but an actual, deliberate movement. Sarah gasped and tried again. Her left leg responded with a small but unmistakable shift. Tears streaming down her face, Sarah braced her hands against the bed and tried to pull herself up. Her legs were weak and shaky, but they were responding. Inch by inch, she managed to get herself into a standing position, using the bed for support. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to give out, but they held. She was standing. Actually standing. Taking a step seemed impossible, but Sarah thought about Mark's grandfather, about choosing to try even when no one was watching. She lifted her right foot and placed it forward. It was clumsy and unstable, but it was a step. Then another step. And another. By the time George woke up the next morning, Sarah had managed to walk from the bedroom to the bathroom and back. A distance of maybe 20 feet. But it might as well have been 20 miles. "George," she said softly, standing beside the bed. George opened his eyes sleepily, then bolted upright when he realized Sarah was standing next to him. "Sarah. Oh my God, Sarah." He jumped out of bed and caught her as her legs finally gave out. "How? When? How long have you been able to?" "It just started happening last night," Sarah said through tears of joy. "But George, it wasn't the doctors or the therapists or the treatments. It was remembering who I am." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical appointments and tests. The doctors were amazed. They found that some nerve pathways had regenerated in a way they had thought impossible. But they couldn't explain why it had happened now, after 3 years of no progress. Sarah could have told them about the night she decided to try again, about the pizza delivery driver who reminded her that she was worth fighting for, about the moment she realized that walking again wasn't just about moving her legs, it was about moving her life forward. But some miracles are too personal to share with everyone. A month later, Sarah was walking with the help of a walker and preparing for her first presentation to a major architectural firm about her accessible design concepts. She had come full circle, not just back to walking, but back to dreaming. The doorbell rang that evening, and Sarah walked slowly to answer it, still amazed by the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. Standing on her doorstep was Mark, holding a small bouquet of flowers and grinning from ear to ear. "I heard the good news," he said. "I wanted to congratulate you." "Mark, how did you know?" "Small town. Word travels fast when a miracle happens." He paused and looked at her standing there, supporting herself against the doorframe but standing nonetheless. "Although, I have to say, I don't think it was really a miracle." No. I think it was just someone who remembered how to hope." Sarah invited Mark in for dinner, where he met George properly for the first time. As they sat around the dining room table, Mark shared his news. He had started architecture school and was already working on designs inspired by Sarah's accessible concepts. "You know," Sarah said, "I've been thinking about starting a foundation. Something that combines accessible architecture with support for people with disabilities who want to pursue their dreams." "That sounds incredible," Mark said. "What would you call it?" Sarah looked at George, then back at Mark. "The Second Step's Foundation. Because sometimes the most important step isn't your first one. It's the one you take when you decide not to give up." 6 months later, Sarah walked across the stage to receive an award for innovative accessible design. Her steps were still careful and deliberate, but they were her own. In the audience, George watched with tears in his eyes, and Mark cheered from his seat next to his new girlfriend, James, the physical therapist's daughter, whom he had met at one of Sarah's foundation events. After the ceremony, a reporter approached Sarah for an interview. "Mrs. Smith, everyone wants to know. What was the turning point? What made the difference in your recovery?" Sarah thought about that question for a long moment. She could talk about the medical mystery, about the unexpected nerve regeneration, about the breakthrough treatments they never actually used. Instead, she said, "Sometimes healing happens when you remember that you're not just fighting to get back to who you used to be. You're fighting to become who you're meant to be." "And who are you meant to be?" Sarah smiled and looked out at the crowd, seeing all the faces of people who had been part of her journey: George, Mark, James, and dozens of others who had supported her foundation. "Someone who doesn't give up," she said. "Someone who builds bridges instead of walls. Someone who believes that the most important step is always the next one." As the reporter walked away, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mark, now dressed in a suit instead of his pizza delivery uniform, but with the same kind eyes. "Pretty good answer," he said. "I learned from the best," Sarah replied. "A very wise pizza delivery driver once told me that the body follows the mind, but the mind follows the heart." "Smart guy," Mark grinned. "I bet he's proud of how far you've come." "We've all come far," Sarah said, looking around at the celebration. "That's what happens when people don't give up on each other." 3 years after that first pizza delivery, Sarah Smith had not only learned to walk again, she had learned to run toward her dreams. Her foundation had helped dozens of people with disabilities pursue careers in architecture and design, and her accessible building concepts were being implemented in cities across the country. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from medical miracles, but from the simple act of one human being reminding another that they are worth fighting for. George often said that Mark, the pizza delivery driver, had saved their marriage and their lives. Mark always insisted that Sarah had saved herself. He had just reminded her that she could. Either way, they all knew that some of the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes the key to walking again isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering what was never broken in the first place. The human spirit, the capacity for hope, and the power of refusing to give up on yourself or the people you love. If this story inspired you and you want to hear more amazing stories of hope, resilience, and the power of the human spirit, subscribe to the Beyond Yesterday YouTube channel. New stories are posted every week that will remind you that no matter where you are in life, your best days aren't behind you, they're ahead of you. Click subscribe and join our community of people who believe that yesterday's limitations don't define tomorrow's possibilities.